Well, hello everyone, and welcome to week one of our class. This week we're going to focus on an introduction to project management. We're going to look specifically at project phases and then how we actually go about managing projects by looking at different processes that are broken down into knowledge areas and process groups. And we'll get into that in a lot of detail. We'll take a look at project teams, and we'll wrap it up with a discussion of the project charter, and then look at our assignment and discussion for this week. I want to highlight a couple things up front. All of our material that you can see on the left-hand side of the slide is found within our classroom. It's embedded into the classroom. You don't need to go externally for any material at all. But you see on the right is the Project Management Body of Knowledge, PMBOK version 6, and I include references to it throughout our slides for those of you that are interested in a little more detail or perhaps pursuing project management as a career field after your education is complete. I want to talk about PMI a little bit more as well. If you're interested in joining PMI, the organization, as a student, there's a student membership which costs only $32 for a year, and it includes electronic versions of all of their references, including the PMBOK. So it's a pretty good value, and I'll talk more about that later with some posts within our classroom. But I just want to highlight everything is in our classroom. You don't need to go externally. I do reference the PMBOK throughout there, so you know where to find the material I'm talking about if you have a copy of it and you wanted to follow along. Some of our slide conventions. On the top of each slide by the title, I indicate in parentheses where from the ebook the material came from that we're talking about, so you can go back and reference it. If you see the two asterisks, that means it was the additional resources that were built into our classroom, so you can find those in our classroom if you want to look those up. And I also provide citations for the graphics that I use that I found for our class that are useful, so you can go to those websites yourself if you'd like. So let's talk about project management. So there's the definition of project management. It's the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to project activities to meet the project requirements. So in other words, it's how we get things done to deliver something, to deliver an end state, a product or a service. All the tools that are used to make that happen. And kind of key to that is the scope. The scope is the description of what it is we're producing. You must understand the scope in order to produce whatever it is going to be the deliverable. So the definition here is, of course, is a carefully crafted document that reflects the performance specifications of the project deliverables, what it is we want to produce. Scope is a very important component of what is known as the triple constraint, sometimes referred to as the iron triangle. But there's three parts to it, and you can see in the graphic: scope, time, and cost. The key thing to remember here is it's reflected on a triangle. The triangle has equal sides. All three elements are important, and a change to one will impact the other two. So if I change the scope, I will impact the time and I will impact the cost. So it's important to remember a change to any one of the elements will necessarily lead to an impact of the other two. So let's take a look at a project. It's a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product or service. And the graphic on the left is a good rundown of the different reasons that projects happen. That's not all of them, but it's a good rundown. The key thing there is it's a temporary endeavor, so it has a start and it has a finish. We're going to talk about project phases next, but you got to understand the key thing there is it starts and it finishes. And if we skip down to that last bullet, projects have a definite beginning and end, and it produces a deliverable. Operations continue. And I'm going to give an example to make that a little clearer. Our project might be to develop and deliver a website for a business to use. That would be a project. It has a beginning and an end. When the website is completed and delivered to the business or the customer, the project is complete. At that point, the customer has the website, but there will still need to be ongoing support of the website. You have to change the content, someone needs to be the webmaster, and so on. That is operations. So building it and delivering it was a project. Maintaining it once it's delivered to the customer is operations. Very important to understand the difference between those two. So let's see where projects sit. And again, we're going to talk about phases, and this is kind of a good way to take a look at them. Projects kind of sit in the middle. So you have the business on the left-hand side of the slide determining that they want to produce something, a service or a product. Then they actually decide to go ahead and begin a project. And you can kind of see in the middle here, it says initiating, planning, executing, and closing. That's the project. And on the other end, on the right-hand side, is the deliverable, which is the end state. And that's where operations begin. So I wanted to make that very clear so you understand the difference between a project and operations. Let's talk about project phases because they do progress logically from start to finish. And let's generally talk about what the phases are, and we'll get into them a little more detail in the slides here as well as throughout our course. But generally, they'll have a beginning, a conception, and an initiation. Somebody decides that they want to create something. And I'm going to use the analogy of building a house as we go through these. So the conception initiation phase is the determination, hey, we would like to build a house. Tired of renting, we're going to build a house. Let's go ahead and do it. That's the initiation phase. Then it moves into kind of the defining what it is we want and planning how we're going to get there. So during this phase, we decide what we want our house to look like, where we want it to be, how much money we have to build our house, and approximately how long it is before we want our house to be done. All of those things happen during the planning and definition phase of a project. And you can see down below some of the things that are part of it. And we're going to talk about these in a lot more detail later. I just want to talk at a high level here. So once we've kind of planned out our house and some of the key elements of it, then we get into the construction phase, which is number 3 there, project launch or execution, where the construction workers are actually on site, preparing the ground, laying the foundation, building the frame, and so on, actually building the house. That's phase 3 right there. Phase 4 goes along concurrently with phase 3. So there's always going to be people there that are looking at the construction, making sure it meets the quality control standards, it's built appropriately, the building inspectors, the code inspectors, and so on. That's performance, project performance and control, making sure it's built to standard, it meets the scope, it meets the project requirements. And at the end, which is phase 5, project close, the house is done, you've closed on the loan, you've moved into your house, the house is completed. The project is completed. That is the end of it. Those are our project phases from start to finish. And we're going to talk about more of this as we go. Now, there's lots of processes that go into the project management from start to finish. In fact, there are 10 knowledge areas, and they're listed here. And as we go through our 8 weeks together, we're going to talk about all of these. Each one of these knowledge areas has processes in it that go through the different tasks we need to do project-wise to get things done. But the knowledge areas focus on all the different areas that we need to consider as part of a project. It starts, I know it says start here with integration. We'll talk about integration last. It starts with scope. You know, what is it we want to do? What are the details of it? Time. Well, how much time do we have? How are we going to schedule the activities in order to meet our time requirement? Cost. What is our budget? How are we going to allocate funds to make this happen? And remember, scope, time, and cost, those are our iron triangle elements. Then we look at quality. You know, how good, how well does our end state meet what we want it to be? How well does it meet the scope? Then we look at some of the other factors like the human resources that go into making the project, doing the work. How are we going to communicate with the different folks that are part of our project, both upward, downward, and laterally? How are we going to manage risk? Because there is risk in every project. How are we going to manage the risk? We have to identify it. We have to determine mitigating steps that we can take. Procurement of services, procurement of supplies and equipment, how are we going to manage all of that? And then stakeholders are the key folks that are part of our project. And then integration is the last, it says start here, but it's the last of it, which is how we tie everything together. How do we tie all of those other 9 knowledge areas together to actually manage the project. So this is important because on the next graphic, I'm going to show you where over the course of our 8 weeks together, we're going to talk about each one of these knowledge areas. All right, so this is a mapping of knowledge areas to process groups. Now, a couple slides back, I talked about phases. If you remember the phases, each of the phases is a process group. So initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, and controlling, and closing were our 5 phases. Each phase is a process group. So if you look down those columns, and down the far left column are our knowledge areas, the 10 knowledge areas that I spoke of. And you can see how the knowledge areas are mapped to the process groups. And obviously, since I said planning was the biggest of the process groups, you can see it has the most knowledge area processes in there. So you can kind of see the relation between the knowledge areas on the far left and the process groups along the top. And what you see there with W1 through W8 is where in our course we're going to talk about these things. And I thought this would be useful so you can kind of see from a high level to a more detailed level where we're going to cover these different things. So you can see week 1, week 2, we're going to talk about initiation. Specifically this week, we're going to talk about the charter. And we'll talk more about initiation in week 2 as well, and we'll get into planning, the planning process group in week 2. And if you look over at the knowledge areas, we're going to talk about integration and scope management and communications management knowledge areas in week 2. Then in week 3, we'll talk about the schedule. Week 4, we'll talk about cost management. Week 4, resources. Week 5, risk. Week 6, we'll talk about quality. Week 7, we go into the process groups again, talk about executing and monitoring and controlling and closing. And then week 8, we wrap it up with procurement and stakeholder management. So we're going to talk about all of the knowledge areas and all of the process groups. So you're going to touch on all of these. And then the assignments that we're going to do over the course of our class are going to give you a chance to actually apply these different tools and skills hands-on as a team and individually. And I think that's very useful rather than just hearing about it and seeing it on a slide. So let's talk briefly about project teams. Now that we kind of have a general understanding of the phases and the process groups and the knowledge areas, let's talk more about teams, because all projects require a project team. It's never just the project manager alone. There's a whole lot that you can read in the ebook, as well as some of the additional material. I only want to highlight a couple of things that I think are very important. And that 4th bullet down there talks about influencing without authority. That's very important for a project manager, because a lot of times you will have members of your project team or stakeholders who do not, you have no authority over them, but you need to influence them to do things as part of the project, or to agree with your course of action, or to agree with your decision. So there's a lot of influencing that goes on, and probably communication skills is probably one of the most important skills you would need as a project manager. So that's very important. So I just wanted to highlight that there. So let's talk about the project charter, and there's additional material built into our class that you can find. But the project charter, you can consider it kind of like a contract between the project sponsor and the project manager and team. It really lays out the purpose of the project, what we need to do, how we're going to measure success, how we know we've got there and we did it right. Some of the high-level requirements, we don't have all the details yet, but high-level requirements, a high-level timeline about when we want this to be completed, with some discussion of some initial risks, the money we have to work with to start with, some of the key folks or stakeholders that will be involved, and so on. It also talks about, it assigns the project manager. That's where I say it's kind of like a contract. It assigns the project manager and gives him or her some resources, perhaps a project team or some other resources to use. And it's signed by the sponsor. And we're going to actually create one in week 2. That's going to be ITP1. That's going to be our assignment for ITP1, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But we're going to do it in week 2. So we're going to talk about it here, and we're going to do it in week 2. Let's talk about our assignment for this week. Now, we just talked about charters, so our assignment for this week is TPP1. And I want to highlight, you can find all of this information in the ITP master document as part of your class. You could find it in there. This is in pages 17 to 22. But our assignment for this week, week 1, is to produce a team process plan and schedule. So you can kind of think of it as like a little mini charter with your team as to how you're going to organize yourselves, how you're going to accomplish the work you need to for this class, because there's a lot of team projects or team work, and an initial timeline of what you need to do to accomplish all the work over the 8 weeks. So you can think of it as kind of a rehearsal for the charter that you're going to produce in week 2. So it's just kind of an overview of what you're going to do, how you're going to organize yourselves. So that team process plan will be done in Microsoft Word, and there's exactly what you need to do is found in that ITP master document, and then the schedule will be done in Microsoft Excel. So let's talk about the discussion for week 1. So week 1's discussion, the lead is group A, and the topic is how can we define project success. So for group A, really what you need to do is do a little research. You come up with your answer. There is no wrong answer. Use some reputable sources, make sure you cite them, and then by Wednesday, provide your initial thread. Everyone in Group A should do that. So 4 or 5 people in Group A, there should be 4 or 5 threads, one for each person. And in Groups B, C, and D, please do your responses. Earlier is better than later. Respond to at least 3 posts. Use some outside sources and make sure you cite them. And in Group A, make sure you continue the discussion by responding to your classmates' replies. All right. Make sure the initial posts are due. Make sure the initial posts are posted, or you've created a thread by Wednesday, responses by Sunday. You can see that there. The assignment is due on Sunday. Make sure it's uploaded in the assignment section. It is a team or a group assignment, so each group should post it. And then after that's all done, so the following Monday, you can post it in the discussion area so that each group can see the other group's work, and then everybody can learn from everyone else, and you can kind of incorporate the best parts of the other teams into yours. If you have questions, please contact me by email. My email is right there. You can also post on Ask Your Professor. Please don't wait to the last minute if you have any questions. I will get back to you right away, so please let me know if you have any questions. And I think that wraps up our week 1, and I will see you again for week 2.